There are a lot of different ways to apply fertilizer. We talk quite often about broadcasting and banding. Well, one of the ways you can band is what we would call pop-up, right in the furrow, applying fertilizer. Now you have to be careful about which products you use and which crops we're talking about, and certainly the rate. So that's why we wanted to talk about this subject just a little bit today before we get into planting season this spring.
Well, there's certainly some equipment options that you have for planters to be able to apply fertilizer right in the furrow. You may dribble it right on top of the seed. You may use a splitter to shoot it out to the sides of the trench. You may use a Keaton. There's just a number of different equipment options. And when you talk to one farmer, he may love one system and the next farmer has different soils and finds a different system that works better for him. If you've got a lot of clay in your soil, you really have to watch out for sticky soil. If you've got lighter sandy soils, you may have some more options. You may have some more flexibility on how you do it.
All right, Darren mentioned these different soil types. Kind of the way I look at it is, if I've got a lighter soil with low organic matter, I got to be really careful, because all these fertilizer things, when I'm talking in furrow, they are much more of a concern in a drier overall environment. When there's moisture and heavy soil, there's certainly not as much risk. The other thing that lowers the risk is the amount of soil in between the seed and that fertilizer. So if you're putting anything directly on the seed, well, we don't love that. That's a lot more dangerous. If you can be off to the side or somehow get a little bit of soil in between the fertilizer and the seed, that's a much better thing in terms of safety. But either way, we really encourage you, try to pick safer products rather than the more dangerous ones that have a little bit more salt.
It's been a real focus for us on our farm is finding these safe products. We've really liked, for a phosphorus source, a product called ProGerminator. It's one we've used for a number of years on our farm. Even when we mess up and we get a higher rate than we were intending to put in the seed, we've seen good levels of safety in corn. We've also used a little bit of it in soybeans. Brian gets really nervous with anything in the furrow in soybeans, so he's not as comfortable with this as I am. But if you move over into 2x2, soybeans could be a good option for liquid fertilizer as well. Then when it comes to potassium sources, we've really liked Sure-K. We've also liked Calibrate. Both have been good sources of K that we can use safely in the furrow.
Yeah, the main thing is find something that's very low salt. Okay, salt is your enemy when we start talking in furrow. The other thing that you can do is dilute the product down. I don't care which product you're using. If you blend it with some water, that definitely helps safeten it. And it seems like you just get a little bit more uptake, a little bit more response yield-wise.
The other thing is micronutrients. We're seeing a lot of guys that want to get micronutrients on right at planting time to make sure that they've got some out there for their crop all through the season. That's absolutely fine. Oftentimes you'll see rates of 1 to 2 quarts being put right in the furrow. Some of the highest yielding guys across the country will put a gallon or more. I know on our farm it's very common for us to use a gallon of micronutrients in a blend right in the furrow. We've seen some good luck with that over the years. We've gotten a little more consistent results than we have out of just doing a foliar with a blended product. But if you're going to use micronutrients in a foliar program, you could definitely use that a little bit here and a little bit there to spread it out throughout the season.
All right, but Darren said a gallon of micronutrients. That really concerns me. Any of these things that are going to have salt, you have to be super careful with. Try some stuff on your farm, but all I can tell you is this. A lot of guys that we talk to will say, hey, 3 pounds of salt per acre, 5 at the most. That's all we want to see. Okay, so if we're talking 5 pounds of salt, for example, in a 30-inch row, that's about 3 gallons of 1034O. Well, some people say, well, I'm using 5 gallons, I'm using 8 gallons, I'm using 10 gallons of 1034O, and I've never had a problem yet. Well, that may be, but that year is coming, and we've seen it before where guys have used it for many years, no problem, and all of a sudden, one year, 50 bushel yield loss. The corn comes out of the ground, it's all twisted up. That's a bad day when you walk out into your field and you see, uh-oh, what I used, what I spent money on actually hurt my yield tremendously. So be super careful with pop-up fertilizer.
And anytime we talk about putting fertilizer on in the furrow, we get the questions, well, what else can I do at the same time? Fungicide has been one of the things that there's been a lot of interest in. Can I put a fungicide like xanthion, for example, right in the furrow? We do that commonly on our farm, especially when we're planting early in cooler soils. It can be done. However, you'll need separate tanks and you'll need to not mix those things together because in general, fertilizer and fungicide don't mix very well together. However, there are some insecticide products that do mix fairly well, like Capture LFR, for example, and Ethos XB. Those are good options that you could potentially mix with fertilizer products.
I guess the other thing I wanted to add is we've been talking about this pop-up fertilizer, and yes, you can throw some insecticide with it, fungicide, can't mix it, but it also could go in the furrow. But if you want to do a lot of fertilizer, you've got to look at something else. So if you start telling me, well, I need 200 pounds of actual K, or I need 150 pounds of actual P, you can't do that in furrow. You've got to do a broadcast or some other type of band out there to get that much fertility on. When we start talking in furrow, yes, there's some products you can maybe get by with 5, 10, 15 gallons in furrow, but preferably we like to see the lower end rates a lot of times and used on a very regular basis. So even in our high fertility soils, we're still using some pop-up fertilizer, 2 gallons to 4 gallons, something like that in corn, maybe a half gallon to a gallon in soybeans. If you want to use higher rates, use 2x2 method. If you need to use really high rates, that's where we suggest you broadcast, just for the simple safety factor out there. We just don't want to get too much anywhere near the seed.
Well, putting fertilizer right in the furrow is certainly an option that can be done in a number of different crops. Just watch the amount of fertilizer that you're putting in that furrow so you don't get too much salt in close proximity to the seed.
Well, the problem with putting fertilizer on any ground is you're going to fertilize the crop, but you're also going to fertilize weeds. We'll talk about how to control our weed of the week coming up later in the show.